What happens when an arrogant tech billionaire throws a vicious tantrum and calls a humble waitress stupid? He doesn't just ruin her night. He unknowingly sets fire to a $3.5 billion empire. Grab your popcorn, because this is the true story of the most expensive insult in Wall Street history. The ambient lighting inside L'Atelier Noir, one of Manhattan's most fiercely guarded and exclusive Michelin-starred restaurants, was designed to make its billionaire patrons look flawless. The imported Italian marble floors gleamed beneath bespoke crystal chandeliers, and the air hummed with the quiet, expensive sounds of clinking baccarat crystal and whispered corporate espionage. At 26 years old, Sarah Jenkins knew this room better than she knew her own apartment. She knew that the man at table 4 was quietly divorcing his wife, that the woman at table 7 was quietly buying up real estate in Tribeca, and that the margin for error for a waitress in this establishment was exactly 0. Sarah was exhausted. The dull ache in her lower back was a constant reminder of the double shifts she had been pulling for 6 months straight. Ever since her father passed away, leaving behind a mountain of uncovered medical debt, Sarah had put her graduate studies at NYU on hold to keep her family afloat. She was sharp, highly educated, and immensely observant, but tonight she was just the girl in the crisp white apron whose job was to be invisible. At 7:45 p.m., the glass doors opened, and invisibility became impossible. Richard Caldwell walked into the restaurant like he had just purchased the building. At 42, Richard was the CEO of Nexus Data Systems, a rapidly expanding logistics tech firm that had recently graced the digital covers of major financial magazines. He wore a custom, razor-sharp Brioni suit, a $50,000 Audemars Piguet watch, and an expression of permanent, sneering dissatisfaction. He was flanked by his chief operating officer, a nervous, sycophantic man named Gregory, who practically jogged to keep up with Richard's aggressive strides. "I don't care what Morgan Stanley says," Richard barked loudly, ignoring the maitre d's polite greeting. "We push the valuation to $3.5 billion. Pendleton will pay it. The man is ancient. He's practically begging for a tech portfolio to modernize his assets. He's going to sign the term sheet tonight, and I want everything perfect." Sarah was assigned to table 1, the crown jewel of the dining room. It was a secluded, semicircular velvet booth that offered complete privacy. As she approached to pour their sparkling water, she could practically feel the nervous, toxic energy radiating from Richard. He was a man on the precipice of absolute wealth, desperate to close the deal of his lifetime with Arthur Pendleton, a legendary private equity titan known for his deep pockets and ruthless business acumen. "Excuse me," Richard snapped, before Sarah had even spoken. He didn't look at her face. His eyes remained glued to his glowing smartphone. "This lighting is completely unacceptable. It's too dim. Do I look like a bat to you? Turn it up." "I apologize, sir," Sarah said softly, her voice a practiced melody of customer service grace. "The lighting in the dining room is centrally controlled to maintain the ambiance, but I can certainly bring a discreet reading lamp for your documents if you prefer." Richard finally looked up, his eyes narrowing. "Did I ask for a reading lamp? I asked for the lights to be turned up. Go find the central control and fix it. And bring us a bottle of the 96 Krug champagne. Don't take all night." Sarah offered a polite nod. "Right away, sir." For the next 40 minutes, Richard Caldwell made it his personal mission to terrorize the staff. When the champagne arrived, he complained it was 2 degrees too cold. When the amuse-bouche was served, he demanded to know the exact provenance of the beluga caviar, cutting Sarah off mid-sentence to brag to Gregory about his own private chef. But the true breaking point arrived with the main course. Richard had ordered the restaurant's signature dry-aged Wagyu ribeye, but demanded it be butterflied, cooked well done, and smothered in a side of synthetic truffle oil, a preparation that the proud, temperamental French executive chef vehemently despised. When Sarah approached the table to gently explain that the chef respectfully declined to butterfly the Wagyu, as it would destroy the integrity of the $300 cut of meat, Richard's thin veneer of civility shattered completely. "I'm sorry. What did you just say to me?" Richard demanded, his voice rising, drawing the eyes of the surrounding billionaires. "The chef recommends a medium-rare preparation, sir, to preserve the—" "I don't give a damn what the chef recommends," Richard exploded, slamming his heavy hand down on the table. The sudden violence of the gesture caused his hand to clip his own crystal water goblet. The heavy glass tipped, shattering violently against the edge of the table and sending a wave of ice water directly onto the lapel of his immaculate Brioni suit. There was a collective gasp from the neighboring tables. The dining room went dead silent. Richard stood up, his face flushed with a terrifying crimson rage. He looked down at his soaked suit, then locked his furious eyes onto Sarah. "Look what you did, you stupid, incompetent girl!" he roared, pointing a trembling finger in her face. "Sir, I am so sorry. Let me get a towel," Sarah began, reaching out instinctively. "Don't touch me!" Richard yelled, swiping her hand away. "Are you blind? Are you completely mentally deficient? I knock my glass over because I have to sit here and argue with a peasant about a piece of meat. This is a $5,000 suit, and you just ruined my night." Sarah stood frozen, her cheeks burning with humiliation. She had dealt with demanding guests before, but this was a public execution. "This is exactly why you carry plates for a living," Richard sneered, his voice echoing through the hushed restaurant. "You have the IQ of a pigeon. You are a nobody, a stupid, uneducated little girl who can't even take a simple order. Get your manager out here right now. I want you fired. I want you on the street before my guest arrives. Now get out of my sight." Sarah didn't cry. Her jaw tightened, her hands trembling slightly as she looked Richard dead in the eye. With a quiet, devastating dignity, she simply said, "I will send the manager right over, sir." She turned on her heel and walked away, leaving Richard to loudly complain to Gregory about the absolute incompetence of the lower working class. In the safety of the stainless steel kitchen, Sarah finally allowed herself a single, shaky breath. Jean-Luc, the seasoned general manager, rushed over, his face pale. He had seen the entire exchange from the floor. "Sarah, go to the break room. I will handle him," Jean-Luc said quietly, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You are not fired. I will comp his champagne and soothe his ego. Just stay out of sight for a while." "He's a monster, Jean-Luc," Sarah whispered, wiping a rogue tear that threatened to spill. "He knocked the glass over himself." "I know, my dear, I know. Wealth does not buy class," Jean-Luc sighed, smoothing his tie before walking out into the lion's den. Back in the dining room, Richard was holding court. He was dabbing at his suit jacket with a napkin, looking highly pleased with himself. The adrenaline of his outburst had energized him. "You see, Gregory," Richard said, leaning back in his chair and swirling his champagne, "that is how you establish dominance. You have to remind these people of their place in the food chain. You show weakness, they walk all over you. Arthur Pendleton is an apex predator. When he gets here, he's going to want to see a man who takes control of a room." Gregory nodded vigorously, though he looked physically ill. "Absolutely, Richard. Masterful. Where the hell is Arthur, anyway?" Richard checked his watch, annoyed. "It's 8:30. He was supposed to be here 20 minutes ago, to sign the term sheets. Actually, Richard, I've been here since 7 o'clock. The voice didn't come from the front entrance. It came from the shadows of Table 9, a dimly lit, unassuming booth tucked away in the back corners of the restaurant. Richard froze. A man slowly stood up from the corner booth. He was 68 years old, with perfectly groomed silver hair, wearing a conservative navy blazer and a simple blue tie. He held a folded copy of the Wall Street Journal in one hand and half-empty cup of black coffee in the other. He had instructed the maitre d' to sneak him in through the side entrance an hour early, strictly forbidding them from announcing his presence to Richard. It was Arthur Pendleton, the billionaire founder of Pendleton Equities, the man holding the keys to a $3.5 billion kingdom. Richard immediately leaped to his feet, his arrogant sneer instantly morphing into a mask of desperate, sycophantic joy. "Arthur, my God, you're here. We didn't even see you come in. Please join us. Let me get you a glass of the Krug." Arthur did not smile. He did not walk toward Richard with open arms. Instead, he approached the table with the slow, deliberate pace of a judge walking to the bench. His eyes were cold, calculating, and devoid of any warmth. He stopped at the edge of the table, ignoring Richard's outstretched hand. "Gregory," Arthur said, his voice quiet but commanding enough to freeze the blood in the COO's veins. "Take your briefcase and go wait at the bar. I need a word with your CEO." Gregory practically tripped over his own chair in his haste to escape, fleeing to the mahogany bar across the room. Arthur looked at Richard, who was still standing with his hand awkwardly suspended in the air. "Sit down, Richard." Richard swallowed hard, his confidence suddenly evaporating. He sat down. "Arthur, I'm sorry about the delay. We had a minor issue with the service here. Completely unacceptable, really. I had to put a waitress in her place." "Jean-Luc," Arthur called out, cutting Richard off completely. The general manager, who had been hovering nearby, stepped forward. "Yes, Mr. Pendleton?" "Could you please ask Sarah to come out to the table?" Arthur asked politely. Richard's stomach dropped. "Arthur, really, that's not necessary. The girl is a liability. She's completely incompetent." "Silence!" Arthur snapped. The single word cracked like a whip across the table. Richard snapped his mouth shut. A moment later, Sarah emerged from the kitchen. She looked confused and apprehensive, but her posture remained perfectly straight. She walked up to the table, keeping a safe distance from Richard. Arthur turned to her, his demeanor instantly softening. "Sarah, my name is Arthur Pendleton. I have been sitting in that booth for an hour and a half. I watched this entire miserable spectacle unfold." Sarah blinked, surprised. "Mr. Pendleton?" "I want to personally apologize to you," Arthur said, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet dining room. "I apologize for the horrific, inexcusable behavior of my former business associate here." Richard's head snapped up. "Former?" Arthur reached into the breast pocket of his blazer, pulled out a thick, folded stack of papers, and placed them gently on the table. It was the $3.5 billion acquisition contract, the term sheets that Richard had been salivating over for a year. "Richard," Arthur said, slowly turning his gaze back to the tech CEO, "do you know what my job is? My job is risk assessment. When I invest $3.5 billion into a company, I am not just buying software. I am buying the culture. I am buying the leadership. I am buying the man at the helm." Richard began to sweat. "Arthur, please. This is a misunderstanding. I was just stressed about the deal. There is an old, unwritten rule in business, Richard. It's called the waiter rule. Arthur said, leaning forward, resting his knuckles on the table. A person who is nice to me, but cruel to the waiter, is not a nice person. It is the ultimate litmus test of character. Arthur tapped his finger against the contract. I sat in the corner and watched you demand the impossible. I watched you deliberately shatter a glass in a fit of infantile rage, entirely by your own clumsy fault. And then I watched you blame this intelligent, hard-working young woman. I watched you demean her. I watched you try to strip her of her dignity to inflate your own fragile, pathetic ego. Arthur, it was a mistake, Richard pleaded, his voice cracking, the panic fully setting in. It's just a waitress. It has nothing to do with Omnitech's EBITDA or our quarter-over-quarter growth. It has everything to do with it, Arthur thundered, his voice finally rising, echoing off the marble walls. If you are willing to publicly abuse a woman over a spilled glass of water, what do you do when a product launch fails? What do you do when the SEC comes knocking? What do you do to your junior engineers when they make a coding error? You are a tyrant, Richard. You are a man utterly devoid of empathy, accountability, and emotional intelligence. Arthur picked up the $3.5 billion contract. With deliberate, agonizing slowness, he tore the thick stack of papers directly in half. The sound of ripping paper was deafening in the silent restaurant. The merger is dead, Arthur stated, tossing the torn halves onto Richard's lap. Pendleton Equities is withdrawing all funding. I will be calling Morgan Stanley and Blackstone in the morning to inform them precisely why I walked away. By noon tomorrow, you will be toxic waste on Wall Street. Richard sat paralyzed, the color completely drained from his face. He looked at the torn papers, then at Arthur, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He had just lost his empire. Arthur turned back to Sarah, his expression softening back into a warm, respectful smile. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek, embossed business card, slipping it onto the table in front of her. Sarah, when you finish your graduate degree, or if you ever decide you want to leave the hospitality industry, Arthur said gently, you call the private number on the back of that card. My firm is always looking for people who can maintain their grace under fire. It is a rare trait. Sarah looked at the card, then up at the billionaire titan. For the first time all evening, a genuine smile broke across her face. Thank you, Mr. Pendleton. I just might do that. Arthur nodded respectfully. He didn't spare another glance at the ruined, shattered man sitting at the table. He turned and walked out of the restaurant, leaving Richard Caldwell completely alone, staring into the abyss of his own making, drowning in the silence of the room. The morning sun cast a harsh, unforgiving glare through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Richard Caldwell's penthouse overlooking Central Park. It was 6 a.m., but Richard had not slept a single second. The torn halves of the $3.5 billion acquisition contract lay on his glass coffee table, like the remains of a gruesome crime scene. His phone, resting ominously next to the destroyed documents, had been vibrating incessantly since 4:15 a.m. Arthur Pendleton was a man of his word, and in the ruthless ecosystem of Wall Street, his word was an absolute, devastating force of nature. When Richard finally mustered the courage to pick up his phone, the notifications painted a picture of rapid, inescapable financial slaughter. 3 missed calls from the chief financial officer, 14 emails from the board of directors, and a text message from Gregory, his previously sycophantic chief operating officer, that simply read, I am so sorry, Richard. The board has called an emergency session for 8 o'clock. You need to be there. Richard arrived at the Nexus Data Systems headquarters, feeling like a man walking to his own execution. The sleek, modern glass building which he had always viewed as a monument to his own genius, now felt like a towering mausoleum. When he pushed open the heavy oak doors to the executive boardroom, the silence that greeted him was absolute. 12 men and women sat around the massive mahogany table. These were the primary investors, the venture capitalists, and the core board members who had backed his vision. At the head of the table sat David Harrington, the chairman of the board, a man whose patience had always been thin, but today it was entirely non-existent. "Sit down, Richard," David said, his voice flat and devoid of any pleasantries. Richard remained standing, desperately trying to project the aura of confidence that had defined his entire career. "David, listen to me. I know there are rumors circulating about the Pendleton deal. It was a minor disagreement over valuation. Arthur got cold feet. I am already on the phone with Goldman Sachs to secure alternative—" "Stop lying," David interrupted, tossing a freshly printed email onto the table. "Arthur Pendleton did not get cold feet. He sent a personal, highly detailed correspondence to every major stakeholder in this room at 3 o'clock in the morning. He outlined, in agonizing clarity, exactly why he tore up a $3.5 billion term sheet. He cited extreme professional misconduct, severe emotional instability, and a total lack of fundamental leadership qualities." Richard's face flushed a deep, violent crimson. "He is exaggerating. It was a minor altercation at a restaurant. A clumsy waitress ruined my suit, and I raised my voice. Are you seriously going to let a multi-billion-dollar deal die because of a waitress?" "No, Richard," spoke up Charles Montgomery, the lead investor from a prominent venture firm. "We are letting you go because you are a massive liability. Pendleton Equities has blacklisted us. Do you understand what that means? The word is already out on the street. No Tier 1 private equity firm will touch Nexus Data Systems as long as you are the chief executive officer. You are toxic." The reality of the situation crashed down on Richard with the weight of a collapsing skyscraper. He looked at Gregory, who was staring fixedly at his own hands, refusing to make eye contact. The loyalty he thought he had purchased had evaporated the moment the money disappeared. "You cannot do this," Richard hissed, gripping the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white. "I built this company from the ground up. I wrote the original source code. I am Nexus Data Systems." "Not anymore," David Harrington said coldly. "The board has voted unanimously. You are terminated, effective immediately, with cause. Because the termination is with cause, specifically gross misconduct that has demonstrably harmed the company's valuation, your severance package is entirely voided. Security will escort you to your office to collect your personal belongings." By noon that day, the financial news networks were having a field day. Chirons scrolled aggressively across television screens in every trading floor in Manhattan. Nexus Data Systems, CEO ousted amid Pendleton deal collapse. Stocks plummet 40%. Richard's descent was rapid and brutal. The loss of his position triggered immediate margin calls on his heavily leveraged personal investments. His extravagant lifestyle, the penthouse, the Hamptons estate, the fleet of luxury vehicles, had all been financed against the anticipated $3.5 billion windfall. Without that money, and without his exorbitant salary, the banks swiftly moved in to collect. Within 6 months, the penthouse was foreclosed. Within a year, his wife, who had grown accustomed to the golden cage of absolute luxury, quietly filed for divorce, taking whatever liquid assets remained. Richard Caldwell, the once arrogant tech titan who believed he was utterly untouchable, found himself drowning in a sea of litigation, debt, and public humiliation, banished from the elite circles he once ruled. While Richard's world was crumbling into dust, Sarah Jenkins was meticulously building her own empire. 2 days after the incident at L'Atelier Noir, Sarah had finished her final double shift, handed in her crisp white apron, and dialed the private number on the back of Arthur Pendleton's embossed business card. Arthur had answered on the second ring. He remembered her perfectly, and true to his word, he offered her an opportunity. It was not a handout, but a foot in the heavy, notoriously exclusive door of Pendleton Equities. Sarah was brought on as a junior analyst. The environment was aggressively competitive, a shark tank of Ivy League graduates and financial prodigies. But Sarah had an edge that none of them possessed. Years of navigating the complex, high-stakes dining rooms of elite restaurants had taught her how to read a room with terrifying accuracy. She understood micro-expressions, unspoken power dynamics, and the hidden anxieties that drove high-net-worth individuals. She knew when a CEO was bluffing about a company's revenue, and she knew when a founder was desperate to sell. She applied the same relentless work ethic that had kept her family afloat during their darkest hours. She worked 80-hour weeks, devoured financial statements, and slowly but surely she caught the attention of the senior partners. Arthur Pendleton himself became her mentor, grooming her to understand not just the math behind an acquisition, but the human element that dictated success or failure. "Numbers can be manipulated, Sarah," Arthur told her during one of their late-night strategy sessions. "But character always reveals itself under pressure." 5 years passed. The world of high finance shifted and evolved, but Sarah's ascent remained a constant, unstoppable trajectory. By her 31st birthday, she had been promoted to Vice President of Acquisitions at Pendleton Equities. She was no longer the invisible girl carrying plates. She was the architect of massive corporate buyouts, a feared and respected force on Wall Street. In the winter of 2031, a familiar file landed on Sarah's desk. It was Nexus Data Systems. The company had never fully recovered from the disastrous collapse of the Pendleton deal. Without Richard's initial, albeit chaotic, vision and burdened by a series of incompetent replacement CEOs, Nexus had slowly bled capital. Now they were on the verge of total bankruptcy, desperate for a buyout just to keep the servers running. Pendleton Equities was swooping in to acquire the distressed assets for pennies on the dollar, a fraction of the $3.5 billion they had offered 5 years prior. Sarah was assigned as the lead negotiator to finalize the acquisition and restructure the company. The final meeting was scheduled for a bleak Tuesday morning in the Pendleton Equities boardroom. Sarah sat at the head of the long, polished table, flanked by her team of lawyers and accountants. The remaining executives of Nexus Data Systems sat opposite them, looking defeated and exhausted. "The terms are non-negotiable," Sarah stated, her voice calm, professional, and dripping with authority. "We are purchasing the patents, the physical infrastructure, and the client database. The current executive team will be dissolved, and we will install our own management. You will sign the transfer agreements today." The Nexus executives nodded miserably. It was a complete surrender. Just as the lawyers began distributing the final contracts, the boardroom door opened hesitantly. An assistant leaned in. "Excuse me, Ms. Jenkins. There is a man here who insists on speaking with the new owners of Nexus. He says he is the original founder and wishes to propose a consulting arrangement to help transition the software." Sarah paused, her pen hovering over the contract. "Send him in." A man walked into the room. His posture was slumped. His hair had thinned and grayed significantly, and the suit he wore, though once expensive, was frayed at the cuffs and hung loosely on his diminished frame. He carried a battered leather briefcase and wore an expression of desperate, fabricated optimism. It was Richard Caldwell. He did not recognize her at first. He was too focused on the imposing, intimidating atmosphere of the Pendleton Equities boardroom. He walked toward the table, fumbling to open his briefcase. "Good morning," Richard began, his voice lacking the booming arrogance it once held. It was now thin and pleading. "I know this is highly irregular, but I built Nexus data systems. I know the proprietary code better than anyone on the planet. I know you are restructuring, and I believe my expertise could be invaluable as an external consultant. I am willing to work for a very reasonable fee." His voice trailed off as he finally looked up and made eye contact with the woman sitting at the head of the table. Sarah Jenkins sat perfectly still, her hands folded neatly over the acquisition documents. She wore a tailored slate-gray suit, and her eyes held the calm, unyielding power of a woman who held total control of the room. Richard stopped breathing. The color drained from his face as a horrifying shock of recognition hit him like a physical blow. He stared at her, his mouth opening and closing, unable to form a single coherent word. The memories of that night at L'Atelier Noir rushed back. The shattered crystal, the cruel insults, the catastrophic loss of his empire. Miss Jenkins," Richard whispered, his voice trembling uncontrollably. Sarah let the silence stretch. She let the absolute gravity of the moment settle over the room, letting Richard fully comprehend the magnitude of his own destruction. "Hello, Richard," Sarah said, her voice smooth and devoid of any vindictiveness, which somehow made it even more devastating. You are leading the acquisition?" he stammered, his eyes darting frantically around the room, looking at the lawyers who were watching the exchange with cold indifference. "I am the Vice President of Acquisitions for Pendleton Equities," Sarah replied calmly, "and we have just finalized the purchase of Nexus data systems." Richard looked down at his battered briefcase, his hands shaking violently. The realization that he was standing in front of the very woman he had verbally abused and tried to destroy, now holding the absolute power over the ashes of his former company, was utterly crushing. I can be of use," Richard pleaded, a pathetic edge of desperation creeping into his tone. "I just need an opportunity. I need a job, Sarah. Please. I know the software." Sarah picked up her pen. She looked at Richard, not with anger, but with a profound, terrifying pity. "Richard," Sarah said softly, her words echoing perfectly in the quiet boardroom. "There is an old, unwritten rule in business. A person who is cruel to the waitress is not a good person. And they are certainly not the kind of person I hire to consult for my company." She signed the final page of the contract, officially transferring ownership of Nexus data systems to Pendleton Equities. "Security will show you out," Sarah said, without looking up. Richard Caldwell stood frozen for a long moment, the crushing weight of his own arrogance finally breaking him completely. He slowly closed his briefcase, turned around, and walked out of the boardroom, disappearing into the shadows of the empire he had lost, leaving Sarah Jenkins sitting in the light of the empire she had built. What an incredible journey of karma and justice! This story proves that arrogance is a liability, while kindness and grace under pressure are the ultimate assets. Have you ever witnessed someone's bad behavior instantly backfire? Tell us your stories in the comments below. If you enjoyed this dramatic tale, hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more real-life business drama.